Hi, good morning and good evening, everybody. Thank you for participating in the 12th LCS RNet annual meeting. I'm Mikiko Kainuma from IGES and the Secretary General of the LCS RNet. LCS RNet is an abbreviation of Leveraging a Climate Neutral Society Strategic Research Network. It was proposed at the G8 Environmental Ministers meeting in 2008. At that time, its full name was the International Research Network for Low Carbon Societies. The name was changed from Low Carbon Society to Carbon Neutral Society this year, using the same abbreviation. It was convened 11th annual meeting in France, Germany, the UK, and Japan. Until now, we have held annual meeting in person, but this time we have an online meeting. So we can have, but it's good that we can have a broader participation. And Professor Jim Skea and Professor Derk Loorbach will give a presentation on just and sustainable transition at the opening ceremony. Following the opening ceremony, we'll focus on the 4 themes of industry, employment, international cooperation, and finance. As for questions, please use Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and the chat is used for providing information from our secretariat. Now, I'll invite Professor Jim Skea, co-chair of IPCC third working group. He will present on just and sustainable transition. Jim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mikiko, and also thanks for the invitation, to present at the meeting. As you know, I've been involved in LCS RNet right from the beginning, and even before the beginning, right back to the G8 meeting that you mentioned. And it was actually through LCS RNet that I first met Professor Shukla, my fellow co-chair of IPCC Working Group 3. So LCS RNet has a special place in my heart. So if I can put it that way. So you've asked me to talk about a just and sustainable transition, and I'll just open up my presentation to be able to do that. And just to say, I'm somewhat restricted in what I can say at the moment, because I can't talk about the IPCC 6th Assessment Report, Working Group 3, because it's just gone off to governments and it's yet to go through approval. And a lot of my recent experience on just transition has actually been quite specific to the place, to Scotland, my native Scotland, where I've been chairing a Just Transition Commission. So I will try to make my remarks as general as possible, relying just on sort of reports and activities that I've been involved in over the last 3 or 4 years. And to just summarise these, I think these would be the 3 most important items. The IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees, the Special Report on Climate Change in Land, which our Working Group 3 managed, and the work on just transition from a Just Transition Commission that I chaired in Scotland, and which is actually going into a 2nd phase, and the membership of that is actually just being announced today, later in the Scottish Parliament. So what I'll do is I'll take it through. I'll give some of some of the key conclusions from the 2 IPCC special reports, and then try to draw some more generic lessons on just transition from the work that I was involved in over the last 2 to 3 years. So starting with IPCC, and in fact I'll start with the Working Group 1 report on the physical science, which was approved in August this year. And it obviously made a huge impact. The UN Secretary General described it as code red for humanity. And I think, from our point of view, the big 3 conclusions are: it's absolutely unequivocal that the climate has changed, and it is human influence that is basically the only cause of the change that we've seen over the last 150 years. We can already see the impacts that are occurring all over the world. And third big conclusion, which takes us into our kind of territory, that it's only if immediate and deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions take place that you can limit warming to 1.5 degrees, or even 2 degrees for that matter. So where did the 1.5 degrees report come from? It wasn't IPCC's idea to produce it. It came out of the Paris Agreement, which has the famous Article 2, holding the increase in global temperatures to well below 2 and pursuing efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. So at the time, I think there was a fairly good understanding from the fifth assessment reports the implications of 2-degree warming, but very little was known about the implications of limiting warming further to 1.5 degrees. So the Conference of the Parties invited IPCC to produce a special report that had 2 homework questions. One of them was the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees, and the second one was the kind of the greenhouse gas emission pathways associated with that level of warming. So just to take quickly through the homework questions, and again, you know, the impacts isn't our kind of territory, but I think it's always good to remind ourselves of why we're actually wanting to limit global warming. So this is the famous burning embers diagram, and the intensity of the colours basically demonstrate the level of risk associated for different kinds of systems at different warming levels. The vertical axis is warming above pre-industrial levels up to and just above 2 degrees, and the grey bar running across the middle of the chart is what the global temperature increase was, I think, over the decade 2006 to 2015. So that's indicates where it is. Now, the recent Working Group 1 report said we're up to 1.1 degrees. So already the needle has shifted quite a lot, even since the 1.5 report came out in 2018. And what this is showing, right on the left-hand side, the warm water corals, we can demonstratively already see the impacts of climate change at the kind of warming that we already have. And at 2 degrees warming, we would in fact lose all of our warm water corals. At 1.5 degrees, maybe about 25% would remain. So that was a strong conclusion. There are other areas in which we can see significant differences between warming of 1.5 to 2 degrees. So I just pick out fourth from the left, the Arctic region, and the degree to which you get ice-free Arctics in summer. It would be once a century at 1.5 degrees warming. It would be once every decade at 2 degrees warming. So a big difference between 1.5 to 2 degrees. 2 systems along on coastal flooding, that's another area in which you can see significant changes in risk between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So the overall conclusion on the impacts homework question was that there is a significant difference in impact between 1.5 and 2 degrees warming. And that has really, I think, sparked the activity that led to the Glasgow COP26 and the mantra about keeping 1.5 degrees alive. Now, turning to the Working Group 3 side of the homework question, at the time there were about just under 100 scenarios in the public domain that were compatible with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And on the left-hand side of this PowerPoint, you can see the blue band shows you the range of these. For pathway for carbon dioxide emissions over the 21st century, compatible with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees without a lot of overshoot in the middle of the 21st century. And the big headlines from that is you will, in almost all scenarios, you need to get to net zero, and typically net zero by sometime around mid-century. Though there is quite a lot of uncertainty given the kind of the shape of these curves and the very shallow approach to zero emissions in several of the scenarios. And the other headline for the shorter term of emissions would go down by about 45% during this decade compared to current levels to put us on a pathway to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So I don't need to tell people there just how ambitious that is in terms of delivering these kinds of changes. On the right-hand side of the diagram, what would need to happen to emissions other than CO2, and I'd flag out methane emissions, which mainly come fugitive emissions from fossil fuels, rice paddies and cattle. These would come down, and they would come down in the earlier, perhaps by about 30 to 50% in the early years, and then sort of gradually decline during the 21st century, but never reach zero. And at the bottom right-hand corner, nitrous oxide emissions, again, largely from agriculture and application of fertilizer, which would come down somewhat. So the big message is net zero CO2 pretty much, and substantial reductions in the other greenhouse gases. Now, are we on target to do that? This is a graph that was produced by the Framework Convention on Climate Change back in October, and it was based on pledges that governments had made up till the end of 30th of July this year. Just to say, there have been further pledges since then, but actually the biggest movement has been on net zero targets for mid-century rather than the NDCs out to 2030. And what this is clearly showing is that since the Paris Agreement and the first initial nationally determined contributions, there has been progress. Previously, the expectation based on the INDC's emissions would continue to go up. The latest set of NDCs indicate that emissions will stay roughly constant between now and 2030. But of course, if we compare that with the graph on the previous slide, that is still not nearly enough to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, or even for 2 degrees for that matter. So some progress has been made, but it's certainly not compatible with the Paris long-term temperature goal expressed in Article 2. Now, I think the other big message that came out of the 1.5 degrees report was that there is more than one way of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, or indeed well below 2 degrees. So what they pulled out, the authors pulled out 4 different so-called illustrative pathways from the set of almost 100 I showed a couple of slides back. And what this slide shows is different pathways for carbon dioxide emissions. And the solid blue line is net carbon dioxide, which reaches net zero mid-century in all of these pathways. The grey represents emissions from fossil fuels and industry. The orange is emissions or sinks from agriculture, forestry and other land use. And of course, for example, through afforestation, land use can act as a sink for carbon dioxide. And the yellow, which has proved much more controversial, is associated with bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, which is net negative as a system, but has a number of other consequences, which I'll be coming on to. Now, just to say, I mean, I think the debate about the feasibility or the plausibility of these scenarios is the subject of some debate. With P1, the criticism has been made it's too fast, and at the other end, that it's too negative in the longer term. And that might imply there's a sweet spot in the middle, but even these are very, very challenging scenarios for P2 and P3. And just to give you a kind of calibration on pathway 1, the declines in emissions that would take place year on year, about sort of 5 or 6%, are equivalent to the 1 year reduction we got from COVID in the year 2020. And this would have to be repeated and accumulated for 20 to 30 years. So you can get a sense of just how dramatic that is. And with the BECS, the yellow part, the negative carbon emissions on the right-hand side, this is equivalent to shifting amounts of carbon dioxide that are bigger than the volume of oil and gas shifted through pipelines in the current energy system. It is very, very large. Hence the criticisms, too fast on the left, too negative on the right. Now, we produced in the 1.5 report some sort of headline indicators of the kind of things that would need to happen in the real world if you were to follow these 1.5 degree pathways, and they relate to renewable energy, getting out of coal use, electrification of demand and much more energy efficiency, and big system changes in transport and buildings. But the International Energy Agency, I think rather helpfully, produced a report earlier this year with a net zero emission scenario in the energy system for 2050, which they say is compatible with 1.5 degrees warming. And they, as part of that, produced a set of milestones for what needs to happen. So just to pick out a few at random there, I hope the slides are available and people can look at that, or they can look at the IEA report. But by 2030, 60% of global car sales would need to be electric. Now, I say global, there may be certain market niches, and I think Japan might be interesting there, where there might be other technologies that are used. There would need to be 1,000 gigawatts of solar and wind additions to electricity systems annually. And unabated coal would need to be phased out of advanced economies by that 2030 date. By the year 2035, no new internal combustion engine car sales, 50% of heavy truck sales are electric. By 2040, half of the fuels used in aviation are low emissions, and there are net zero emissions from electricity globally. And also by 2040, complete phase out of all unabated coal and oil-fired power plants. Not the phase down that's written into the Glasgow Pact. And by 2050, more than 85% of all buildings would need to be zero carbon ready. And globally, about 3/4 of electricity generation would have to come from solar and wind. So huge changes in energy systems would be required in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, of course, having managed the special report on climate change and land, I'm strongly reminded that it's not just about energy. Other aspects, land use, are also very important. And just to say, as an energy person, I always thought it was difficult, and it was only when I started to get my head around land use changes that I realised this was much more complex and much more challenging than anything about energy. Some energy decisions, you can make a single decision that has huge consequences, say the gigawatt offshore wind farm. With land use, you're much more looking at the changes made by millions, if not billions, of small-scale landholders and farmers. It's a much more difficult transition to make. But we did find some optimism in the report about the responses that could be made. And it's quite important in the report, we didn't think about mitigation responses and adaptation responses separately. We just thought about responses that have mitigation, adaptation, and outcomes in terms of sustainable development. And the reason for that, there's an awful lot of co-benefits to be realised in the land use area. And I'm not going to go through the methodology for this rather intricate figure, but just to say blue is good and orange is bad. Blue is basically about positive impacts. And as you can see, the dominant picture is that there are many measures out there that are not necessarily large scale, but together can add up to a lot, that could make a lot of change, especially on taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So these include agriculture, issues like cropland and livestock management, forestry management, reduced deforestation and forest degradation, management of soils, which particularly has multiple benefits. Reduced soil erosion, building up soil carbon increases fertility and also sequesters carbon from the atmosphere. And there are other things that would be very important given other developments this year, including fire management, of which of course has been very prominent in the news. And I think interestingly, this report for the first time got into the demand side of the food system. So we looked at the potential from reducing food waste, which can happen in the food chain or at the consumer end of it, and the prospect of dietary changes, which we had to word extremely carefully. So just to say, there's an awful lot in the land sector that could make a difference. But we were concerned about some options which, if exercised at scale, could have actually quite negative implications in terms of sustainable development goals, food security via increased food prices, and the prospect of impacts on ecosystem services and biodiversity. So there were 4 areas we picked out there, not on this slide. There was biochar and afforestation, but we also had reforestation and forest restoration and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, where large-scale land use changes, which is the essence of all of these things, would have these negative impacts. So the strong message there was, sure, these things have to a place to play in any portfolio of mitigation options, but they need to be applied in an extremely careful way with regard to the kind of crops, the kind of species that are used, the extent of the land use, and the nature of the management practices that are put in place. So there was definitely a caution in there. And I think it's fair to say, without going too much into the next Working Group 3 assessment report, that the scenarios that have been produced then have been much more sensitive to these concerns. And just to say, rather than the 100 scenarios that were referred to in the 1.5 report, we now have a database that, after screening, contains about 1,200 scenarios altogether at different levels of warming. So in the second half of the presentation, I'm going to talk just a little bit about issues around just transition, where I have been chairing this Just Transition Commission in Scotland, which ran for just over 2 years and came up with a set of recommendations, all of which were accepted by the Scottish Government, and has resulted in the appointment of a minister, a new ministerial portfolio for just transition, employment and fair work in the new Scottish Government. So we feel we've had an impact, and the Just Transition Commission is now going into a new phase, which will involve it scrutinising what government has been doing, considering indicators and measures for measuring progress towards just transition, and continuing a process of engagement with people who are potentially infected. Now, just to say, one of the parallel things that came out of the Glasgow COP26, one of the side agreements, was a Just Transition Declaration that was signed by a group of European countries, notably Poland, which got this going at COP24 with the Silesia Declaration. So a number of European countries, New Zealand and the United States, all signed this Just Transition Declaration, which has 6 different elements to it. And obviously, one of the challenges is that there will be, people will need to transition from sectors and within sectors as a result of the transition to net zero economies. And so this was pulling out the question of support for workers in the transition to the new kind of employment, which includes issues like training and reskilling especially. A second element to it, and this really draws on from the original Just Transition declarations that came from the International Labour Organization, that social dialogue is that the process matters as well as the outcome. So the continued social dialogue and stakeholder engagement has to be part of it. You need overall economic strategies that set the framework for the transition that will need to take place. And then a variety of other issues around making sure that there is decent work, that fair work conditions are put in place, and that lots of thinking about this takes place at the local level, again with people's involvement. And a lot of thought about how supply chains can operate. So when people are procuring goods, the kind of conditions that they put on their suppliers can be an important part of ensuring a just transition. And finally, all the signatories to this agreed that they would report on progress towards just transition when they were reporting their NDCs and making their biennial reports on their longer term strategies. So the countries that signed up to this were quite ambitious in where they want to go. And in the case of my own country, the UK, it was really the first time just transition had really featured very strongly in any policy declaration. The UK had been following a slightly different track. So when we produced our original Just Transition report, nobody has ever defined what just transition means, but there are a set of principles out there that started with the International Labour Organization. We actually found this, the civil servant who was helping us draft our report had this in something like footnote 3 on page 26, but all of the commissioners thought this was such a wonderful quote, we actually brought it right to the front as a signal to governments as where they might go. So the imperative of just transition is about designing policies in a way that ensures the benefits of climate change action are shared widely. And I think it's something we need to emphasize a lot more, that there are benefits from climate change action, while the costs don't unfairly burden those least able to pay or whose livelihoods are at risk as the economy changes. So that was kind of our North Star for moving things forward. As we carried out our work, we were very concerned to understand what we meant the scope of the just transition concept. And in many parts of the world, including with the agreement that a number of countries have signed with South Africa, the primary issue is about exiting the coal industry, about how to phase it down or phase it out according to your preference. And just to say, this wasn't relevant for the work I was doing because Scotland's last coal-fired power station closed in 2016. In fact, the chimney was blown up rather spectacularly just a couple of days ago to symbolise the end of coal in the country that I come from. Scotland, many parts of the world, the emerging issue is not just about how you get out of coal, but how that exit is made from the oil and gas industry. And this, I think, is a particular issue for resource-rich developing countries that might be counting on revenues. And we took it not just about the supply side, we were thinking about people as consumers and citizens, and emphasising, as in the Just Transition Declaration, the importance of place, communities and local action. And just to flag, we also saw that the world is an unjust place already. And there are many, the injustices that we recognise locally were issues around land tenure in Scotland, issues around fair work, were people leaving the power station going to deliver pizzas as their new employment, or were they going to work at the Amazon regional distribution centre? Big questions around energy poverty. If energy prices rise, can people afford to pay them? On big issues, which I think we're only just getting into, about applying the just transition concept globally, about fairness to countries at different levels of economic development. But there is a chance to address some of these existing injustices, not just avoid injustices that might emerge in the future. So distilling it out of the work that we did, and we had 24 recommendations in all, but we distilled these into 4 overall themes to help communicate it better. First one, you need an orderly and managed transition. It needs to be planned for, because unplanned transitions tend to be unjust transitions. So we need national level missions to try to make sure that we are planning for net zero. The second one is that people need equipped with the skills and education. They need to benefit from the transition. And we actually found many bizarre obstacles to people making that transition from one sector to another through certification and for skills, for example. Need to empower and invigorate communities and strengthen local economies. And I think this is a point worth making, that just transition, it will absolutely depend on local context. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. And finally, very critically, to make sure that benefits are shared widely and burdens are distributed on the basis of the ability to pay. And for example, in the UK, there have been a lot of costs for decarbonisation already, but they've almost all been paid for by electricity consumers rather than taxpayers, which means it has a rather regressive effect in terms of social outcomes. So these were the 4 areas that I think I would pick out as where action is needed. Now, very last slide, and just to say, I mean, I can't talk about the Working Group 3 AR6 report, but this is the outline that's been agreed with governments. Lots of work on specific sectors and systems. We've got the usual chapters 2 to 4, which are taking a helicopter view, but a new chapter on mitigation and development pathways in the near to mid-term, which in fact is the home for the discussions within the Working Group 3 report on just transition. It isn't mentioned in our scoping document, but it's mentioned in the scoping document for the synthesis report, and Working Group 3 is the channel through which that will be delivered. And just to flag, there's two new things in the report that have never been in a Working Group 3 report before. Chapter 5 on the right-hand side on demand, services and social aspects of mitigation. So the fact that we're talking so heavily about people and consequences is very important. And also for the first time, chapter 16 at the bottom left, a chapter on innovation, technology, development and transfer. So people and technologies and the way they interact have really been very much taken up in the next report. And at that point, Mikiko, I'll bring the presentation to close, and I should be almost right on my half an hour, I think, if I've done the calculation correctly.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for timekeeping also. And we have two questions from audience. Actually, I have many questions, but anyway, from the audience. One question is from land grab becomes more serious these days, even with community involvement in line with land reform to gain land ownership for improvement of land productivity. What is your suggestion to protect vulnerability life and rights under green transition? If you have any.
Yeah, this is not my area of expertise, but I mean, talking to people who do, I mean, I think in many developing countries, the question is actually assigning formal title to land, so that it's very clear, who has the title to the land and who owns it. And the fact that, many of the rights to land are customary rather than written into law is an issue. So I think that this very much depends. It's going to depend a lot on history and particular local context. So I think it's very, very hard to generalize. But I think the general point that's important to make sure that people have title to land is important. Just to say, the issue we had in Scotland with land is that Scotland has an enormously concentrated pattern of land ownership with a lot of tenant farming that comes on top of it. And there are big issues now with the drive towards converting agricultural land to planting trees, of tenants being removed from land in order to make room for planting trees. And often you will find that these tenants, their homes are actually a part of the tenancy. And it does get extremely complicated. This is one of these areas that I was humbled by, the link between tenure arrangements, inheritance law. It's incredibly complex. And I think every country will have its own particular institutional problems, but they can be particularly difficult to grapple with, I think.
Thank you very much. And the second question is to implement Glasgow Just Transition Declaration. How do you see the resource mobilization and the practical roadmap?
Yeah, okay. I mean, very obviously, with the Glasgow Just Transition Declaration, most of the countries that signed it were from Europe, and most are members of the European Union. So the European Green Deal and the Fit for 55, has a provision to start to shifting the money. But so I think it's important that happens. But I think a lot of the practical implementation is actually much more appropriate to be taken at a local and regional level. When we did the Scottish Just Transition Commission, it was surprising how little we talked about money and how much we talked about process and the practical roadmap part of that question. And it was really very much the point of the first recommendation I put about making sure that you have just transition planning in place is absolutely there. You do need to know that roadmap in order to so that everybody understands their place and has the confidence to make the investments to undertake the costs of retraining, which might fall on individual workers or individual people. So that is absolutely a challenge.
Yeah, thank you very much. And another question is, what do you think the raw materials, resources for new technology, including renewable energy? How is the way to calculate energy measure social cost for comparison? Yeah.
Well, the way to calculate the energy measure social cost, I'll turn it right back to the LCS RNet and say that it's up to the academics to figure out methodologies and ways of doing that. I think in a sense the easiest calculations can be made on the environmental side. It's perhaps more the social indicators that are the biggest challenge for measuring that. And it's worthwhile saying that again in the Scottish Just Transition, one of our more specific recommendations was to develop indicators that is to not to get rid of GDP as a measure, but to use other measures that measure human well-being alongside GDP. And you could also think about more specific measures about education, literacy, etc., that are there that you might be. And I think the other side of that question was the raw material side, and of course the electrification would demand a lot more use of materials like lithium, exotic materials there. And I think that's something we do need to keep a careful lookout for. But there are also technical issues like being able to recycle material as the technologies become more mature that could be an important part of it.
Yeah, thank you. And Scotland is, I think, the top runner. I think that, Scotland already achieved near 100% renewables. In 2020, it's 97.4%, and it's compared to other countries, it's great. And the question from the audience is what were the response from coal-related and power sectors toward transition to renewables in Scotland? In Japan, oppositions or reluctance shown from those sectors and very strong in Japan. So
Okay. Just to say the coal-related sectors, that didn't come into play in there because the coal industry in the UK declined very fast during the 1980s and 1990s, and by the time we've got to the last decade or so, almost all the coal being burnt in coal-fired power stations in the UK was actually imported rather than domestically produced. So there was no opposition from the coal end of it. In the power sectors, actually, the companies have grasped the alternative. They have actually embraced the idea of moving to renewables. I mean, the two companies that are very active in Scotland, SSE and Scottish Power, are both very proud of the fact that they're running huge wind farms, both onshore and offshore, and they are making money off it, partly because these are supported through the contracts for difference policy mechanism. So frankly, the opposition has not been there. And some of the bigger challenges around balancing the system have been addressed by a lot more investment in transmission infrastructure that allows power to be shared. Frankly, it's gone. Now, the big issue in Scotland won't be coal and power, it's going to be oil and gas, because a lot of the Scottish economy and part of the country has been reliant on North Sea oil and gas production. That will be the touchy issue.
Yeah, thank you very much. And what is your thoughts on creating the society to secure all for fair and decent work on the way of transition to green society?
Yeah, well, the implications that are in there. I mean, I mentioned skills and training as a big part of it, and there is a need to provide sort of reskilling and training for people mid-career for some of the changes that will take place. But for example, in the oil and gas industry, many of the skills that are used there can be redeployed in a net zero economy. So if we take, for the example, many kind of civil engineering operations in offshore oil and gas can be redeployed for offshore renewables. So there's the same kind of skills that can be used. Some of the yards that used to service offshore oil and gas platforms can be reconfigured to build, towers for offshore wind turbines, for example. And there's one very recent example of that taking place. The geologists who worked on oil and gas exploration can look at characterizing and monitoring carbon dioxide disposal in geological storage. And some of the downstream skills can be redeployed in hydrogen and carbon capture. So many of the skills are there, but just to say, there are also big new skills, because one of the big challenges is going to be retrofitting the building stock, and we need much deeper retrofits that have taken place so far, and that is going to involve upskilling the labour force to do that, and will probably increase both the number of jobs required and the level of skills required to actually carry out the work, and making sure that training in place is going to be critical.
Yeah, thank you. I have many other questions, but yeah, if allowed, I can ask you about the Climate Citizens Assembly, and recently France and UK and many other places, Climate Citizens Assemblies are held, and I had this in Scotland. Also, you have the Climate Citizens Assembly. And I think the citizens' participation is essential to realize the carbon neutral society, and the suggestions from the citizens, I think is very, very important. And it is related to local actions. So in the Scotland Citizens Assembly, the participants are also requested to consider the just transition, the just transition is the focused in their discussion.
Right. Just to say, the Just Transition Commission that I was chairing is a completely different process from the Citizens Assembly. Yeah, though I did go along to the Citizens Assembly and attend some of its sessions. So just to say, and first of all to say, the kind of the Assembly, did have a request to look at the issues, but it was not following instructions. The outcomes were dependent on what the participants wanted to say, and some of the things might have surprised people. So they weren't asked to tick a few boxes and come up. It was a very bottom-up process. So several dozen people convened over a period of several months, and they gave up 4 complete weekends to get together to discuss the issues. And in the earlier meetings, they heard from experts. So my role was to go along and be grilled and quizzed by ordinary people about some of the technical aspects of the questions. And then as the process moved on, they started to distill these into recommendations for things that they would like to see government to do. And in fact, the people in Scotland were so enthusiastic, they asked for a 5th weekend to be added to the process. So they must have actually enjoyed it. We were, of course, under COVID restrictions by then, so it may have been a sort of cultural value as well as anything else. But at the end of the day, what was produced in the report, there were a large number of recommendations which were classified according to the degree of agreement among the participants. So many recommendations, about 80% of the people agreed on them. There were others in which there was a bit more controversy. And they included, fairness and just transition were a very big part of it. But it wasn't because they were asked to look at it. They wanted to look at that and wanted to tell that to policymakers.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much for your presentation and answering these questions. And now the time is come, so we have to finish this plenary session. And thanks again for your presentation.
Then welcome again to everybody. I'm very happy that you are here and that we can start after this very interesting introduction with Jim Skea with session 1 of this year's annual meeting of the LCS RNet, which is on decarbonisation in industries. And we have 2 very good presentations and 3 great speakers. And so we will discuss in the next hour the topic of particularly energy intensive industries. And I think now most people know that industry is responsible for 25 to 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions, depending on how you count. At the COP26, not only just transition was announced, but also industry played for the first time an important role, particularly with a focus on commitments to greening steel industry, which is the largest emitter. And of course, there is a strong connection between industry and just transition, the topic we just heard a lot about that, because industry is located and there's also investment challenges, reskilling challenges, all sorts of these things linked to deep decarbonization and defossilization of industry. And that's why I'm very much looking forward to this session. And we start with Frederick Bauer from Lund University, working on deep decarbonization of industry with his presentation. Frederick, we are looking forward to your presentation and please start. Welcome.
Yes, thank you very much, Stefan. I hope you can all see my slides. Great to get some confirmation. Brilliant.
Great. Great.
Yes, so thank you very much for the invitation to present at this year's annual LCS RNet meeting. So my name is Frederick Bauer. I'm an associate senior lecturer at Lund University at the Department of Technology and Society, and I have also been a contributing author to the IPCC 6th assessment report from the Working Group 3 chapter on industry. So I will today share some insights from the work with this chapter. We also then have others who were lead authors there. I will share some images and insights from this chapter that our coordinating lead author has generously allowed me to share with you today. Please note that they are still not finally approved, so these are still draft versions that may change in the final version, although it has been submitted. And after that, I will talk a bit more about the particular challenges in the global petrochemical industry, which is the focus of my own research primarily these days. So firstly, we see that industrial emissions have been growing faster since the year 2000 than emissions in any other sector, which is quite striking and alarming. So we see that there are in particular a few important sectors, namely the basic material industries, where emissions have grown the most. And these are then iron and steel, cement, and chemicals. And what's particular about these is that they all have significant and large process emissions, the ones that are labeled IPPU here. So there's really been a dramatic increase in the new millennium with a actually growing rate of emissions compared to the decades before. So not yet is the transition really picking up in these sectors, which is indeed alarming. And these basic materials are particularly interesting here, not least because we see that the production of basic materials is actually growing quicker than both population and GDP globally. possibly we see a sort of leveling of the demand for demand growth in major construction materials, but less so for consumer goods materials. And one of the key insights is that interventions for demand reduction and material efficiency is really an underexplored toolbox, and one that needs to be developed much more in the years to come to break this curve or turn this curve downwards instead of increasing upwards. We conclude that yes, close to net zero or net zero emissions from these greenhouse gas intensive industries can be achieved by 2050. It is possible if we deploy multiple technological and societal changes that are available as well as emerging. This deployment is, however, not really yet visible, at least not at the rates that actually makes a chance and change. So an acceleration of the deployment of these technologies is absolutely necessary and crucial. And this goes across many domains, such as low carbon electricity, improving energy efficiency, of course, but really what's crucial here to point out again is both demand reduction and improving materials efficiency and circularity. In terms of policy, it's clear that the industrial sector has so far largely been sheltered from the impacts of climate policy. So we really need to think about a new way of or a new approach to industrial development policy that takes the transition challenge as its core and focusing any industrial development on in the direction of reducing emissions and aiming for net zero greenhouse gas emissions. This again goes across many policy domains, so closely connected to these options that we looked at previously. So we need to think about the industrial demand for low carbon electricity, for example, investment support in research, development and innovation, and other instruments that can supplement carbon pricing, which has so far been in several regions of the world a key instrument, but which has not really been effective at reducing emissions in the industrial sector. And then again, repeating the need to look at policies for managing demand and actually reducing demand for these emissions intensive materials. Such an intervention agenda is, however, still likely to meet strong resistance. There are strong interests that are still opposing such changes, and I would like to move over to discussing what this could look like or what effects this has in the context of the transition in the chemicals industry, and in particular then the petrochemical industry. So chemicals, and then we are talking primarily about plastics and fertilizers, is a particular challenge for the climate transition, as the fossil resources really constitute the material products from this industry to a very large degree, to a degree that no other industrial sectors actually has. And this means that scope 3 emissions, so downstream in many value chains where these products are used and applied, as well as end-of-life emissions, are a crucial part of this challenge. However, this is not really embraced in visions or targets set by this industry and its major actors. So what we have seen in the past 25 years is really a large-scale transformation of this industry. rapidly growing demand has led to emissions more than doubling since the mid-1990s. This is due to several reasons. So both that demand and thus production has increased, but also that we have seen a large shift in the structure of the industry, where we see that production has primarily grown in the Middle East and Asia Pacific, and in particular then in China. And this growth in heavily coal-dependent regions has in itself led to increasing emissions intensity in large parts of the industry, where the coal is used both as input and for electricity production, for the electricity that is used in this industry. So coal is again here really a central way, needs to be at center stage of this, as well as phasing out the oil and gas that are used as feedstocks in the production. So unfortunately, instead of seeing a transition, we see that a fossil lock-in is actually continuing. And just to show what this looks like, we have been looking at investment last decade in this industry, seeing that there is actually no shift away from oil and gas, but instead we see that oil and gas is shifting towards chemicals. So really pushing the deepening lock-in of fossil resources in this industry. And when we look at drivers for these investments, we see a few different things. For one, the North American and primarily then the US shale gas boom is driving ethane-based investments in ethane-based production in North America, and also even more recently that the export of this ethane is driving investments in ethane-based production in other markets such as Europe, Asia, and Asia Pacific, primarily then India and China. Another key driver or trend has been the turn towards so-called crude to chemicals technologies. So we see large investments primarily in China and or in Asia and the Middle East, based on maximizing the production of chemicals directly from crude oil. And this is to a very large degree supported and made possible through strategic partnerships with oil majors that are looking for new downstream markets for their product, as fuel markets are decreasing traditional markets such as petrol and diesel. In our most analysis of investments, we see, however, no signs of large-scale investments for decarbonisation, which is quite troubling. And indeed, we find it troubling to see that some of the major information providers or the logics in this industry are instead framed on questions such as this one. This is just an example where one of the major consultancies asks how a circular plastics economy can actually grow the oil industry, which is perhaps not what we are expecting in the era of transitions. So some key messages and insights regarding the transition in energy and emissions intensive industries is that yes, it is possible. It requires profound technological and organizational changes across material value chains. So from primary production, the production of steel, cement, chemicals, to reduce demand, recycling, and end of life of these materials, metals, cement, and plastics, as well as others. And this is not yet fully embraced by either the industries nor policymakers. So there remains work to be done. So these industries must really meet the challenge of net zero emissions. There is a need for a rapid reorientation of the strategic targets and investment strategies in chemicals and other industries that are falling behind compared to the targets that we have set. And new climate and industrial policies are necessary, and they need to be deployed together, developed and deployed together and in parallel for transforming the basic materials industries, which have so far been too sheltered from climate mitigation pressures. So that was a quick introduction to the situation where we are at with the energy and emissions intensive industries. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you. I have the comments mainly to myself. Thanks a lot again, Frederick, for these great insights. Also in the, so to say, political economy of petrochemicals. I think we might have time later to discuss more in depth to that. With regards to the timing, I would, and as I don't see any questions currently in the chat or in the Q&A, so I put my own questions to the discussions later, and would suggest that we now directly move to the next presentation by Imogen Rattle from Leeds University. Imogen is working on industry decarbonization as well, but I guess from a different angle, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, please.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. Good morning and good evening. So I will be talking about industrial decarbonisation strategies in industry, perhaps drawing from some of the comments by Jim and some of the comments from Frederick. This work then is based upon two projects I'm working on, one for IDRIC, the UK Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Challenge, and one for UKIRC, the UK Energy Research Centre. So I'm presenting some preliminary findings from these and synthesising some preliminary conclusions. So an outline then, just briefly, the industrial decarbonisation challenge in context, a little bit about cluster theory, since it is clusters where a lot of certainly present investment is focusing on for industrial decarbonisation, at least in the UK, an outline of research and some synthesis. I won't speak in great length about the industrial decarbonisation challenge because I think it's been covered very admirably in the previous presentations, but industrial activity, at least 26% of global emissions, and would be more were it not for COVID, and energy intensive industry being seen as particularly hard to abate due to its diversity, the long investment cycles, trade exposures. A suite of technology, efficiency and policy measures will be required to address this. The technology is relatively immature, so we will need both investment infrastructure and abundant supplies of low carbon energy to decarbonise industry. This is not to state that we don't also need aspects such as carbon pricing, demand reduction, product standards, but I agree these are needed, but in this particular presentation, I'm focusing more on the interventions around supply side. So this then is a presentation, a slide from the Industrial Energy Agency, and I think it sets out quite as nicely the range of measures which we might look at for decarbonising industry, which include CCUS, energy efficiency, material efficiency, and also the different respective maturity of these different technologies, meaning that they are going to come online sequentially. They're not all going to happen at once. So what then are the implications of this for industrial strategy and industrial decarbonisation strategy? I think we all know there is no silver bullet. We will need an array of interconnected measures and we will need intervention. Drawing from this, technology options will require the co-location of facilities for things like carbon capture and storage, electrification and low carbon hydrogen. These will be in particular places. The infrastructure will be deployed sequentially, not all at once. And so governments, and it will be governments because of the amount of funding needed, will need to deploy infrastructure, and they will need to prioritise areas where they deploy this infrastructure. And this is likely to be, in the first instance, in high-emitting industrial clusters, places like the Port of Rotterdam, Teesside in the UK, which contribute a large amount of industrial emissions for a particular country. And the result of this is that some areas will have access to the decarbonisation infrastructures earlier than others, and therefore greater opportunities to decarbonise, more options, and this risks distributed injustice, as some areas will be able to decarbonise sooner than others. So I think it's useful then to touch upon the idea of clusters here, just because this idea is talked a lot about in policy and in academic literature, but it's important to say the ideas of what a cluster is starting to change. So Michael Porter perhaps elaborated on the idea in 1990 in his book, The Competitive Advantage of Nations, and he focused on clusters as geographical concentrations of particular internet-connected countries and supporting institution research establishments in particular fields that compete and also cooperate. And Porter noted explicitly that resources will flow towards clusters and away from other places. However, more recently, we've started to talk about clusters as a vehicle for decarbonisation. And the International Energy Agency flagged clusters, coastal clusters in particular, as gateways for setting up deployment of particularly clean hydrogen, in this instance, co-location of supply and demand, de-risking investment, economies of scale, hubs of innovation and development to bring down the cost of decarbonisation. So there's a kind of slight change there as clusters as a driver of innovation, or clusters as a driver of decarbonisation innovation. And in the UK, the Industrial Decarbonisation Strategy, which was launched in March, and which is the first major economy which is a launched decarbonisation strategy, particularly focused upon clusters as areas of shared decarbonisation infrastructure, opportunities for resource energy efficiency as well, learning and innovation sharing. So a move very much from clusters as areas of perhaps innovation, economic growth, to clusters as areas of decarbonisation and infrastructure. So the research then looks at these ideas of clusters and also the areas outside these clusters, which we're calling dispersed sites, from two different viewpoints. So the research for IDRIC is on what approaches internationally are being used to drive decarbonisation of clusters. And for UKIRC, it's particularly looking at England and what's happening with sites outside clusters. Two different approaches: rapid evidence assessment, which is essentially a systematic review, but done fairly light touch for IDRIC, interviews for UKIRC, both pieces of research at fairly early stages, so these are preliminary findings. To highlight then what we know from academic literature about the clusters, most studies focus on clusters as this idea of drivers of economic growth, as we might expect from Porter's work. Studies on industrial decarbonisation generally focus upon particular interventions, carbon taxes, or particular interventions such as CCUS hydrogen, and on the highest emitting sectors, steel, cement, chemicals, which produce about 70% of global emissions. There are some place-based approaches to decarbonise in specific regions or industrial clusters. These tend to focus on what we call the blue banana, which is the Central and Western Europe, and encompasses places like Teesside in the UK, Port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. There's presently a lack of country comparisons about what different countries are doing on industrial decarbonisation, possibly because it's a relatively new field, but we are seeing globally in the news is weekly announcements of new decarbonisation initiatives, hydrogen hubs, CCUS hubs. So this is an area where there is development happening. So to go then to the dispersed sites research, and this is focusing on England. England is not necessarily representative of all industrialized countries. It has certain aspects, it being an island, it having access to offshore wind, offshore carbon capture and utilization opportunities. A lot of the industrial clusters are situated on the coast. It has a relatively decarbonized energy system, and it has a relatively high use of gas and a lot of subsurface infrastructure, which might be repurposed for hydrogen. Nonetheless, as the economy, which is perhaps the first major economy to have an industrial decarbonisation strategy, I think it provides some useful broader lessons. So the UK government has prioritised industrial clusters for decarbonisation, and it has the stated ambition to establish a first net zero industrial cluster by 2040 and one low carbon cluster by 2030, so only 8 years' time. However, sites outside clusters, which are 40% of industrial emissions, the focus is on energy and material efficiency with eventual electrification. And the preliminary findings from interviews with key stakeholders in sectors across UK industry, I think the first thing to state, with all the caveats I'm going to follow it with, is that having an industrial decarbonisation strategy with stated aims and targets for decarbonisation has been successful in focusing industry's mind. Across the piece, it was one of the top 3 things that industry was concerned about from the people I spoke to. So it is a good thing to have an industrial decarbonisation strategy. However, the clusters dispersed sites division, focusing infrastructure first on the clusters, risks increasing inequality between sectors and as a result between places as sectors, steel, cement, ceramics generally tend to be clustered in particular places. Outside of clusters, then, concerns about competitiveness are leading to a reluctance to invest in perhaps material energy efficiency measures, which we might want these sites to invest in. And therefore, there's a risk that a lack of strategy for dispersed sites becomes a strategy by default of basically de-investment in sites outside clusters. So these then are a couple of indicative quotes from some stakeholders. They are, I would classify them in the mid-tier of industry. They're not the energy-intensive industry of steel, cement, chemicals. They're the next sector down. They are still use a large amount of electricity or energy, but they're not in the top tier. And so from the glass sector here, we have concerns about inequality within the sector. Only a quarter of their sites are within clusters. The other 3/4 don't have early access to decarbonisation infrastructure. Amongst paper, we have concerns that they are not a big employer and therefore they don't necessarily get government attention. And amongst the ceramic sector, we have here concerns that if you're outside a cluster, despite this perhaps narrative of clusters as gateways, it's actually very difficult to access the innovation and the infrastructure that you might need if you're not within that particular area. Alongside then this, there is a growing narrative, and this may or may not be justified, but it's there, about concern about electrification for industry compared perhaps to hydrogen as perhaps a slightly second-rate option. As I say, I'm not saying this is or isn't true, but that is perhaps the perception. And there are 3 headlines here from UK News over the last month, which kind of sets them out quite nicely. There is concern that electricity and electrical infrastructure is less resilient to climate change than perhaps subsurface infrastructure like hydrogen, less resilient to extreme weather events, risk of disruption to power supply. There's concern about UK's already high electricity prices and what that might mean for competition if electrification becomes a norm. There's a concern that electricity is being touted as a solution to many different sectors, so cars, also perhaps buildings, and is the infrastructure sufficient? Is there going to be enough low carbon energy? In the light then of these various concerns, what we're seeing amongst dispersed sites is a reluctance to invest perhaps in material and energy efficiency, which we might need. So there is concern because this investment may come from abroad, and are you going to be able to track that? There is concern that people aren't going to be able to fund it themselves, because the general narrative is that if material and energy efficiency is only going to get us so far towards decarbonisation, and the rest of the infrastructure, be that electrification, carbon capture, hydrogen, something else, is needed to get us the rest of the way, is it worth doing the first stage of investment if we can't do the second stage of investment to decarbonise, to achieve decarbonisation? And so we have this quote then from a trade union, which I think sets out the issue quite well. Companies don't want to make a mistake and they don't want to invest in something now which might become obsolete. So they are waiting and they're not necessarily investing. And so the risk is not, I think, of carbon leakage of companies relocating offshore to other countries, but there is a risk of investment leakage whereby essentially industries sweat the assets they have, which generally in the UK assets are quite old, industry equipment is quite old, but they don't necessarily make further investments to upgrade because they don't know what the right approach is. And this also leads to, I think, quite a poignant quote from someone from the Black Country. Now, the Black Country is where I'm based. It's in the centre of the UK. It's the home of the Industrial Revolution. It's been industrialised for about 250 years. Arguably, it therefore is the cause of many of these problems, but it is an area with 250 years of industrial heritage. And there's a perception that by the time investment reaches the centre of the country, away from the offshore opportunities for carbon capture and storage and hydrogen and offshore wind, there won't be anything left. So the question here is, we'll sort out industry with hydrogen and CCUS, and by the time they get to us, the investment decisions will have already been made. There won't be anything left, industry is left. And so the question is, for a just transition, is what are we going to do with these places instead? If we're not going to have industry, what are we going to provide them? So synthesis and some initial thoughts. Clusters are an evolving concept and not always as self-evident as they might seem. So are we thinking of clusters as a way in which to increase the competitive advantage of places? Are we thinking of clusters as a way to achieve decarbonisation across the economy? How we think of these will help shape the policy we put in place for industrial decarbonisation. Within both UK industrial strategy and more broadly within the academic literature, there's a focus on the high emitting sectors of steel, cement, chemicals. And this is justified because this is 70% of industrial emissions and therefore they should be prioritised. However, the 30% remaining of industrial emissions from the other sectors also need to decarbonise, and focusing on certain sectors at the detriment of others is not going to achieve deep decarbonisation. And alongside this, certainly within UK policy, the present focus on the deployment of big ticket items, CCUS and clean hydrogen, risks eclipsing the importance of actively managing strategies for material and energy efficiency and electrification. And it is that active management which is required. It isn't necessarily something which businesses are going to do themselves to improve their bottom line. They are going to need encouragement. And so some preliminary conclusions from my research. Setting strategies has value. Industrial strategy, the UK industrial decarbonisation strategy has focused minds. But one of the key messages of COP26 was that we now need to move our efforts away from designing frameworks into the messy and complicated process of actually implementing them. Clusters and dispersed sites are not separate entities, but two sides of the same coin, and therefore all strategies need to manage both aspects, both in clusters and outside of them. More research is needed which takes a holistic approach across sectors, places and decarbonisation approaches, because interventions which prioritise one sectors may inadvertently deprioritise others. And that industrial decarbonisation strategy is in large part a spatial strategy, and that we should consider that in our planning of industrial strategy. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Imogen, for your presentation. Great and very great thanks for reminding us of the, so to say, geographies of industrial transition, which is another important aspect, adding on the political economy of it, which was highlighted by Frederick. So thanks a lot to both of you, also to your timely presentations. And before coming to our other members of the panel, we received now 2 or 3 questions to Frederick, and maybe we start first with discussing them, and maybe our audience has also time to think about more questions in between. So Frederick, I saw I think 2 questions. One in the questions and answers is now gone. But I think it was on the prospects of ammonia developments currently being seen, and the other one is on the 500% increase in the price of gas in the EU and Great Britain. So the recent price increase, I think, is meant here, whether it will change anything in the sectors in mention. So maybe you can briefly go on these 2 questions.
Yeah, so I wrote a brief response to that first question on ammonia and hydrogen in the Q&A, and yes, absolutely. I mean, hydrogen is playing a large role in the sort of transition roadmaps that we see across many industries, but of course also in the chemical industry. And there are sort of important questions that remain to be answered about how that plays with the transition to renewable energy and deployment of renewable energy in the electricity sector. Some analyses show that a massive deployment of hydrogen and CCU-based technologies in the chemical sector would demand basically most of the renewable energy that is forecasted in the world by 2030. So if we go down that route, that has very important and large implications for the transition in electricity and power, for sure. And I think that connection is not yet really appreciated in those analyses, which is definitely needed. So regarding recent price increases, the ongoing global supply chain crisis and multiple energy crises that we see in different regions of the world, I think it's important to differentiate between sort of short-term or transient shocks and the long-term transition. And I mean, immediately, yes, we have seen that the ongoing or recently very high gas and electricity prices that has had an impact on this industry. We have seen, for example, ammonia and fertilizer plants being shut down because gas prices are, or production ramped down because gas prices are simply too high to make it profitable. Without being an expert on these, I think it's still probably fair to say that we don't expect the prices to continue increasing in this way over a sort of long period of time. So we might also see a sort of return to some form of normality there. But in the long term, right, that those are the changes that are important when we are talking about the transition. Of course, a change in, or a shift in the cost for resources is important, and that's why we need to think about how to work both with carbon pricing as well as other types of interventions directed at the basic materials industries.
Okay. Yes, thank you. And one of these strategies for deep decarbonization of basic industries is, of course, circularity, more recycling. That's particularly important, for example, in petrochemicals, where plastics recycling could provide lots of the carbon resources with much less electricity and hydrogen. So very interesting, but also important in all other sectors. And therefore, I'm very happy to have Erika Mancuso on our panel. Erika is from Enea in Rome and an expert on circularity. And maybe you can jump into the discussion and bring us a bit closer to this angle of the role of circular economy in climate protection in industry.
Yes, thank you, Stefan. Thank you for everyone. And many thanks for this great opportunity. I found the previous presentation really interesting, and continuously with the last one, I can just remark a few key messages. The first one in particular way to focus our attention on circular economy approach for reaching an industrial decarbonization. And the second point, I just to remark about the strong collaboration of all stakeholders of public and the private world to reach this kind of industrial decarbonization to achieve the transition toward not only climate neutral society, but also with a circular economy target. So the circular economy approach can contribute to the industrial decarbonization because it consists of a complementary approach that can combine action on the technological but also on organizational level to shift to more sustainable economic model. Circular economy is an industrial economy, restorative or regenerative, which basically involves sharing, leasing, reusing, also repairing, refurbishing and recycling materials, existing materials and products as well, as long as possible. So from a technological point of view, circular economy approach can offer significant potential for mitigating CO2 emissions from economic activities. And the main aspect of this kind of approach is to reduce the demand for virgin materials and consequently the reduction of CO2 emissions associated. So the action of a circular economy approach can be really different, can be really diverse. It can include, for example, the new production techniques, but also change consumption and waste disposal patterns. So in this case, relevant circular economy actions can identify, for instance, extending product lifetimes, reducing material losses, recirculating materials and products by preventing downcycling, or substituting CO2 intensive with less CO2 intensive materials. So the crucial step is the shift, as we know, from a linear economic model that is based on take, make, and waste principle to a circularity. The circularity model is a model in which resources are regenerated and recirculated between different industries. A strength of this kind of approach is that the circular economy can be applied in every industrial sector, can be valid for each production, for every production chain, for every production cycle. And in this point of view, the circular economy approach can surely contribute with a non-negligible share to achieve net zero, because the substantial contribution of emission came exactly from the material production, or in any case can be associated with the material handling and use. So a circular, we can say that a big role can be played by a circular economy approach, because it is an approach, an economy that wants to do more with less, substantially. At the European level, the circular economy with the new Green Deal, as we already seen, is the core set of the industrial strategy for Europe. The new Green Deal aims to transform the Europe into a fair and prosperous society with a modern and resource efficient and competitive economy, where there are not net emission of greenhouse gases in the 2050. So this is the final target. And to make this, all the policy levers are available, from the regulation and the standardization, investment, innovation, so national reforms with social partners, a good dialogue with social partners for an international cooperation. And another point is, in fact, the strong collaboration to reach a climate neutral society. The big, large collaboration with a collaborative approach is strongly requested on this topic. And this kind of target can be reached also by mobilizing among innovators, governments, civil society, and private sector. So with a big involvement of stakeholders from the private, but also from the public world, with the society, with the civil society, and so on. So by taking commitment and accelerate a collective action toward the circular economy, shared platforms, stakeholder forum, collective and collaborative experience in which to share good practice, lesson learned, and on circularity can be really powerful as action on this direction for reaching neutral, climate neutral society, but also with a circular economy strategy. So this is my comment and our point of view, and I'm available to comment and to face with you all these reflections.
Yes, great. Thank you, Erika, for highlighting the role of circularity in the whole debate, and also for leading us to this issue of institutional innovation, which of course is necessary to harness those potentials. And with these words, and also to give the audience a little bit more time to think about question, I would go over to Jim Watson from UCL, because Jim has worked a lot on energy, on industry, and also on innovation. And maybe you can add your comment here and bring us a bit more insights in how we can improve the, so to say, institutional innovation system of industries, which I think all have highlighted that it's not only technology that we are talking about. It's a lot more.
Yeah. Thanks, Stefan, and thanks for the invitation to join the panel. Yeah, that's what I was going to focus on. I mean, Imogen and Frederick have both highlighted in different ways that we sort of have roadmaps, you know, whether at national level or international level, of what needs to be done or what could be done to achieve targets. You know, here's the combination of technologies. It had Frederick's nice wheel and Imogen's graph from the IEA that showed that. But then when you unpack that, as Imogen said, you know, the technologies and measures are at very different stages of development and readiness. And two I'd highlight with big question marks, you know, which are related. One is carbon capture, which for many countries is not on the agenda. For some, like the UK, is firmly on the agenda. And their international progress has been, well, we could be polite and call it slow. It's been very slow, and there hasn't been that many successful deployments that have really shown how that innovation can be achieved. You know, so we've had some demonstrations in different places, often outside the power sector in various industries, but it hasn't yet got to the stage where that's now become routine. And we're seeing things like cost falls and replication and so on, because it is capital intensive and difficult. And then the second related one is hydrogen, where there's a lot of talk everywhere about it in various countries and a lot of strategies. But again, you know, where is the doing that we can learn from and so on? And certainly for the UK and probably many other countries, the success of industrial decarbonisation hangs on those two things, as well as electrification, efficiency, and the other things that were mentioned. I think the second point I was going to mention really jumps off from what I think Frederick said about, you know, the policy measures that are required. And I think certainly in the UK and maybe in some other countries, governments are only just starting to realise what this means, you know, beyond doing some R&D and a few demonstration projects. Actually, we have to approach this in the same way we've approached transformation of electricity systems, and we can actually learn lessons from it. So it's actually the demand pull and the market creation that was on Frederick's wheel that are very important, but really underdeveloped. And we're only just seeing, again, I'll refer to the UK because I know it best, that, you know, the government realizing that actually they need to give that certainty that allows companies to invest, because as Imogen said, companies are not investing. So the same sort of certain long-term contracts you got for the first wind and solar plants, and often still the case in many countries, we're now considering putting in place for industry to use hydrogen or industry to capture CO2. And that can then drive some of those investments. Of course, then separately, you've got to invest in the network infrastructures that are required. For electricity that exists and needs to be expanded, for hydrogen and CO2, often it doesn't. So, you know, that's, I think my main point is that, you know, there is a potential to learn lessons there, but, you know, I think we're only really at the start of starting to put in place what those incentive structures look like, the long-term contracts, which will give that confidence to invest. And then also thinking about products, you know, the products people buy, you know, how can you tell that you've bought a low carbon product? or a high carbon project. It's the same issue as we've had for electricity again. So can they put in place, and again, it's been considered by some countries, new standards, certification schemes, transparency to drive demand. So I think, you know, I'm starting to see signs we're moving beyond the kind of supply push, well, just do some R&D and the government gets involved in that. But if we're really going to meet these targets by 2030, 2035, etc., then we really need to get into the market creation mode. And, you know, there's some signs of that happening, but I think as Frederick said, you know, it's not really making a big impact on investment behavior yet. So hopefully that adds to what they've said and gives rise to a few other discussion points. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Great and very important, I would say, also about the point, can we learn from the electricity sector where the transition definitely is a bit ahead, and came to my mind also, electricity companies had to split the black part or the good part, the bad part from the good part, and that's what they did, at least in Germany, and maybe we will see that in some industries in the future as well. So very interesting. And with that, I would like to hand over to Chris, our last but not least panelist. Chris, I hope you're not in Vancouver. In that case, I wouldn't really say, shall I say good night or what to you? Very happy to have you with us. And as Frederick also already mentioned, you are very active in the IPCC chapter on industry, and it would be great to also have your reflections on the big picture on industry decarbonization.
It was, well, it is almost 3 a.m. in Vancouver.
Okay,
actually, it was lovely seeing Frederick present, because the work the first half of his presentation there is the summed efforts of about 20 people at this point over the last 2.5 years from Chapter 11 in industry. So that's the first time I've seen all that stuff, which has been keeping a lot of us really busy for a while out in the public. So I'm happy to see that out there. I'm going to try to pick up a lot of threads from all the other panelists and end in a bit of a note of optimism. I think we're making a lot more progress. I think we're moving now, especially in the last 2 years, faster than we've ever been going on the industrial file, and frankly, it's because governments are taking it serious. They after signing Paris, they realized, oh no, we can't just ignore industry anymore. We can't give them a free pass. They have to do something. No, we can't use BECS and DAC or what have you to offset 26% of our emissions. So that's just not going to work. So there's a very firm move now towards directionality towards net zero. The steel sector, cement, chemicals, other industries using high heat, all the light industry. It's like now they're getting this signal through to them. It's no, you're not going to have free permits forever. You're in a transition phase now. We understand it's difficult, but you've got to do something, right? Which is very much transforming the innovation and investment picture in these sectors. The next step after the directionality from governments is the road mapping. And we've seen a dramatic increase in the quality of roadmaps coming out of the steel sector, out of cement. There's been some chemicals as well, which has been kind of surprising. But the thing is, roadmaps are just a beginning. They're kind of a technical map of what might be possible, technologies, what have you. They might have a short little ending about what policy means. But the simple fact is, we actually have probably most of the technologies we need to do all of this, and without post-combustion carbon capture and storage. The only sector that really needs post-combustion is probably clinkering for cement, and there's probably options for all the other sectors that don't involve post-combustion CCS. That's not to say we don't need CCS, concentrated flow CCS, in terms of, you know, turning methane into hydrogen or blue hydrogen before we get to green, for fertilizers, for high heat, for as a chemical feedstock, what have you. There's lots of industrial processes that produce concentrated flows of CO2. That is something we can do today. And I think there's been a strategic mistake made by governments not concentrating on these concentrated flows early, starting in the late 1990s, then going to post-combustion. Because the problem is post-combustion is it's quite literally failed. There's a handful of sort of projects projects that work, but there's 50+ projects with concentrated flow CCS that do work. So I think there needs to be a re-emphasis in that direction. Now, we've mapped out in the steel sector probably at least 9 different ways, starting with more recycling, hydrogen reduction, potentially maybe just electric reduction with HAC for primary iron, what have you. There's lots of different ways we can do this in steel now, we're quite aware, but they're all going to cost more initially. And arguably the same thing's going to happen in cement and chemicals. And because we know the first generation of technologies are going to cost more than their competitors, we need to create lead markets. We need that market, that demand creation that Jim was talking about. And frankly, just during COP, not specifically at COP, but you had a green procurement agreement between India, Germany, UK, Canada, and there's one other country in there. They're gonna cooperate on green procurement standards for what, how do you measure it? What kind of subsidy are you gonna offer for contracts for difference, what have you? So that's moving now. Cement is moving. Maybe funny, cement has kind of gone first in this space, and eventually probably cement and steel will follow. But I think we're making progress on that file now. It's getting a lot of attention. Also, the US and the EU have come together on, they're worried about their heavy industry. So they're coming together in terms of how do we protect it. And the first thing we need to know is how we need an international standard for how do we measure the GHG intensity for steel, right? And then that allows border carbon adjustments, border standards. It allows you to offer contracts for differences, subsidies, what have you. So the lead markets, we're getting for the first sort of that first 5 to 10% of the market is good. They're going to need extra money in order to overcome the risk, get through that, getting from TRL4 up to TRL8, because that's the most expensive part of development. There's no revenue, lots of extra cost, but eventually we're going to need carbon pricing that covers everything. No more grandfathered allowances. All GHGs are covered, and there are going to be parts of the regions of the world that go faster than others, and they're going to have to protect themselves with border carbon standards or CBAM or something. That is coming probably in the late 2020s, early 2030s, because certain regions are going to start moving really fast, and Europe is actually moving really fast right now. So I would argue that, we know where we're going with steel. We know where we're going, roughly speaking, with cement. The cement industry, the Global Association, published a really nice roadmap just recently. It's actually quite realistic, and they're engaging quite directly with governments. Chemicals, it's a matter of, you need to clean up the hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon supply. It all has to go to net zero, and that's going to be harder. And you're probably going to have to concentrate down at the key seven big feedstocks at the bottom of that crazy tree of 30,000 different chemical products that we have. The one thing that I think is going to be eventually harder to abate than people expect, Stefan's done a lot of work here, is we know we can electrify much of light industry, right? It's a matter of directly using it, putting in heat pumps, what have you. But outside of Europe, the relative difference between electricity costs and gas costs are huge. So in North America, just a trip, that conversion from gas to electric would take an enormous carbon price that we're just not going to see. So, not in the next, decade and a half at the minimum. So we're going to need something else in there to help light industry make that flip over to heat pumps, induction technologies, plasma technologies, what have you. So, I just wanted to, again, this is hard. We can do this. It's a matter of focusing. This is not as hard as a follow, as Jim noted at the beginning. We can do this over the next few decades. That's it. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris, for this really comprehensive overview. That's from the guy you can wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he gives you a perfect presentation on all the issues of industry. Great. We are already approaching the end of our session. Unfortunately, I think I could talk the rest of the day, and we have the morning here in Germany. So, but I would allow at least one of the questions we have, and that was on the regions and directed to Imogen by Christoph Kassen. And so, Imogen, there is the question, do you have other examples of clustering policies in Europe or maybe beyond, and similar challenges of articulation with dispersed sites? So maybe we put that as our last point in the already very comprehensive inputs that we had in our discussion.
Briefly, I suppose, not that I am aware of, although if people have suggestions, I'll be very pleased to hear them, as this is part of my rapid evidence assessment. I think the UK, in attempting to move first on cluster decarbonisation, is hitting these issues first. Other countries which want to deploy CCUS and hydrogen for industrial decarbonisation, because these will have to be deployed in particular places, they're so capital intensive, I think this will become an issue for other places attempting this strategy in due course. In generally, though, it's not considered in the literature because a lot of cluster research tends to focus on clusters as drivers of innovation and not think of them as decarbonisation vehicles, because decarbonisation has to happen across the whole economy, the whole sectors. So this flip side of clusters is not generally, I have found so far, considered in the literature. But as I say, if people have examples, I'm very pleased to hear them.
Okay, yes, thank you. I think it's a very important point. We see that, for example, when you look at Europe, we have this prime cluster in the northwest of Europe, Benelux, North Rhine-Westphalia, and if Europe directs lots of policies over there, we will have problems maybe in clusters in southern Poland or elsewhere, Romania, with having less attention. And of course, that's only one example. So I think it's really very important highlighting also this dimension of the issue. So thank you for that. Thanks to the audience, to all these great questions. There is still one in the chat, but I think we have covered that in our discussion already a lot on industrial policy for steel industry. And would be very happy to discuss more at other events and maybe later over the course of the LCS RNet, which is still going on. And I'm looking forward in 8 minutes to the session 2, employment for leveraging climate neutral society. And I think the employment topic neatly adds on what we have discussed here, and it is also a very important other side of the coin of decarbonization. And so many thanks to all of you, many thanks to great presentations and discussion interventions, and looking forward to meet you soon, and maybe then also again physically somewhere. Thanks a lot, and see you later.
So welcome everybody to this second session, where we turn to the very important topic of employment for leveraging climate neutral societies. So my name is Peter Taylor. I'm from the University of Leeds in the UK, and I'm also part of the UK Energy Research Centre. So in the session today, we've got 2 presentations, and then we've got 4 panelists that can also comment on the topics raised. So while you're listening to the presentations, I would encourage you to put questions in the Q&A so that we can then come to those when we've heard both from our speakers and also from the panelists. So our first speaker today is Rob Gross from the UK Energy Research Centre, and he'll be talking about evaluating job creation potential in renewable energy and energy efficiency. So Rob, over to you.
Hello there. Good morning and good evening. Thanks very much for the introduction, Peter. Can I just check, Peter, that you can hear me okay? Hear and see me okay, and I'm coming through clearly?
Very well.
Thank you. Right, so without any further ado, I will just get on and see whether or not I can share my screen and get talking you through some of the work that we've been doing at the UK Energy Research Centre on green jobs. So screen share should be starting now, and I'll just put that into show view. I think that's working, and I'll assume that it is unless somebody interrupts me and tells me it's not. Okay, so my name's Rob Gross. I'm the director of the UK Energy Research Centre. you're getting a full kind of gamut of directors of the UK Energy Research Centre today, because Jim Skea was the founding director. Jim Watson took over from Jim Skea. My name's not Jim, so I'm probably breaking the mould of directors by being a non-Jim, but I took over from Jim Watson a couple of years ago as director. And for those of you that don't know anything about UKIRC, it's basically a large consortium of universities within the United Kingdom, publicly funded, so funded by the UK government, but of course academically independent. So we can say what we think and we can criticise government policy when we think it's appropriate to do so. With my colleague Richard, who will be joining the panel shortly, we've been doing some work over the last 18 months or so, looking at the potential for job creation from renewable energy and energy efficiency. I think we gave you some initial findings, talked a bit about this last year. The work's now complete and we'll be publishing our report in January. So I can give you some of the kind of final findings from the report today. Obviously, UKIRC covers quite a wide range of other topic areas. Later this afternoon, we're going to be launching our annual review of energy policy, and there's a great many things that are of contemporary importance at the moment, from COP and climate to the fact that gas prices are at an unprecedented high level. So all of that kind of context, all of this, and what you're talking about through the next 2 days, super important. Energy and climate has never been in more high profile, in my view. Okay, so this is what I'm talking you through. I'm sure you've read the slides. I'm not going to say everything that's on there at the moment. I'm just going to give you a sense of what we've been doing. I'm not going to say a great deal of detail here. Imogen mentioned the use of rapid evidence assessment. So we've been doing systematic reviews and rapid evidence assessments for the last 17 years through UKIRC. And I think it's fair to say that by doing it, we've really helped to inform policy making and decision making in an evidence-based way, and we want to continue to do that. The last time we looked at green jobs was back in 2014. So we felt that it was important to update that work, and that's what we've been doing with the work that we've been doing in the last year or so. This will be familiar to some of you, but it's important just to think about what we mean when we talk about the job creation in the green tech sectors, because we're not just talking about the new jobs that we might create, for example, in wind turbine installation or energy efficiency installation, but we're also talking about the wider indirect and induced job creation in the economy. But we're not just talking about the positives, we're also talking about the negatives. So Jim Skea was focused on the kind of just transition type stuff, talking, for example, about the offshore oil and gas industry in Scotland. And so we will clearly have winners and losers as we transform. If we are successful in moving to net zero, we will be creating jobs, but we will be destroying jobs because there will be sectors that are no longer compatible with a climate compatible growth. And so we need to fully understand that, and we need to understand what the impact is on net jobs in particular regions and countries and around the world. So there's quite a lot of detail in what we've been trying to do with our current research project. So we're interested in the kind of quantity of employment creation. There's a number of methodological approaches to that I'll come back to. We're interested in the kind of life cycle of low carbon energy projects. So there's the construction phase and there's the operational phase, and how those differ from fossil fuel alternatives. Partly because there was a commission in the UK looking at the kind of green jobs issue last year that we fed into and helped to inform. We're also interested in the quality of the jobs that are created. I'll come back to that. You know, do we create high quality, lasting employment or not? And there's some other stuff there that I've already mentioned about the geography of all of this. I won't go into the detail of this, but I think essentially just to say we kind of updated what we've done in our previous review, and we put together a kind of complicated combination of search strings. We used to, in years gone by, put that into multiple search engines, but because of the ubiquity now of Google Scholar and to a lesser extent Science Direct, we don't need to do that anymore. We tested it and we found we were getting the same results by using a smaller number of search engines, which kind of makes our job easier. And then there's a bit more information about what we've been searching for, how many documents that we got, and all of that kind of stuff that I'm not really going to go into today. But for those people that are interested in it, you know, drop us an email, and we're always happy to share our thinking and our work in how to do systematic reviews more widely. So just looking first of all at the kind of quantity of the jobs created. Now there's a couple of things that I draw attention to here. The first is metrics, or the kind of the measurement of employment creation in the energy sector. Do you talk about this in terms of energy production? So we've got here some data in gigawatt hours. Or do you talk about it in terms of installed capacity, so megawatts or gigawatts? And I'm going to come to that in due course. Are you thinking about it in terms of, you know, the amount of money, the capital cost, the expenditure in millions or billions of euros or dollars or pounds or yen? Or are all of those metrics, you know, none of those metrics are perfect. All of those metrics will tell you something, and they will tell you different things. And so that's why we're trying to we'll present them normalized by different kind of options. So you can see, and I'm sure you're just, you know, colleagues will be reading the chart, making an interpretation of what it says. Certainly what you can see is that the ranges of job creation for some of the renewable and energy efficiency options appear to be very much wider. That seems to be a product of the data, and we find that quite consistently. Difficult to understand the reasons for that, and that might be something that we can come back to. But it would also suggest that at least at the upper end of the range, you get more jobs per unit of energy delivered from renewables and energy efficiency than you do from some of the more, you know, the traditional energy options. And then we've started to kind of disaggregate that and think about the manufacturing, and then we think about the construction and installation phases. And so one thing to, obviously to say that manufacturing in some sectors will be split across a number of countries. A wind turbine, for example, has a number of bits that will come from different turbine, the nacelle, power. Those are big engineering projects that will be split across a number of countries, usually within a geographical region because of the kind of the physical nature of the products, the physicality, the large stuff. So the panel manufacturing is almost entirely concentrated now in China. And then looking at the construction and installations phases, which is a much more kind of, you know, local creation of jobs. But the picture that we showed in the previous graph appears to be very much the same. These are in installed capacity terms. It's clear that per unit of capacity installed, more jobs get created in the renewables industry than in the conventional industry. Continuing on, and now this is the pounds spend. Now, I think it's very important to emphasize with regards to all of these, we don't build wind farms in order to create jobs. We build wind farms in order to create green energy to tackle the climate crisis. But we are interested from a political perspective and from a political economy and socio-economic perspective in job creation. And similarly, we don't spend public money or money from bill payers, you know, households, on renewable energy schemes in order to create jobs. So in some respects, all of these metrics are a kind of, you know, they're a slightly strange thing to be doing, because if you're spending you know, £1 million sterling, and you're creating a number of jobs that looks quite small, then you would probably think, well, maybe we should spend our money elsewhere in order to create jobs. There's a macroeconomic dimension to all of this. You know, we can go back to Keynes and we can talk about job creation and so on. Nevertheless, if you are doing this, it's interesting to understand what the job creation is. And it would appear, again, that for the amount of money going in, the employment potential is larger for renewables than for some of the conventional options. And I've just summarized that in the slide. There is a wide range. There's all sorts of uncertainties about the methodology, what's included, what's not included, whether or not it's indirect, direct, or induced jobs, less data for energy efficiency and heat. And obviously, this picture varies in different countries, depending upon the structure of their labour markets. I'm just going to go on in the last 2 minutes or so to talk about the kind of skill level and the quality of the jobs that are created. And you can see this is for wind, specifically in the UK. And we're looking at the kind of mix of skills between managerial and highly trained skilled workers and degree educated engineers and so on. And it seems that it's a kind of it's a high skill sector. I think this is the takeaway from this. There's also incredibly complex data around the mix of professionals and skilled trades and other professions in these different industries. And you can see that in some of the kind of construction installation of solar PV standing out there, the kind of assemblers, that blue bar in the middle, just for example. So it's a very kind of widely divergent and different picture. I don't think we can take anything huge away from that in terms of the what we can conclude from all of it, other than there's a big mix of skills and trades that are required. And we've tried to draw in some conclusions here. And I think, one of the things that we need to say is that there is evidence to suggest that green and low carbon jobs tend to be more highly skilled than the kind of higher carbon occupations. There is, whether the extent to which that's true varies according to studies. The second thing to say is that we need to re-skill. We need to coordinate the availability of skills and supplies. If we're interested in a just transition, we need to ensure that people can take advantage of that transition. So that, if it's locally and in an area that was reliant upon, for example, oil and gas production, we need to be able to help people to transition, because otherwise those areas will be left behind. And we are seeing in many country contexts, including the United Kingdom, that low carbon policy has become very much focused on regional opportunities, regional redevelopment. We talked about clusters in the context of industrial decarbonisation. We can equally talk about clusters in parts of, in our country, focused on offshore wind, where there's demonstrable benefits for some very disadvantaged areas that have suffered from the loss of heavy industry or shipbuilding and so on in the past. But we need to actively make this happen. It won't happen by itself. So I think I'm just on time there, Peter, so I'll stop. And thanks very much for the opportunity to speak. Now trying to work out how to stop the share.
Thanks very much, Rob. That was great. Thank you for keeping to time. And thank you for providing a really good introduction to the topic in terms of some of the concepts and issues, as well as providing some interesting insights and results. So we now move on to our second presentation. This is from Akihisa Kuriyama, who's going to talk to us about the situation in Japan and the opportunity of a low carbon economy for Japan's industry, the status of local employment under a depopulated society. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody, and good morning everybody. Thank you very much for giving these precious opportunities for providing presentations. My name is Akihisa Kuriyama, researcher of IGES. Today, I'd like to make a presentation entitled Importance of employment impact on the local area to expand renewable energies. So this presentation is jointly developed by Professor Abe, who is an associate professor in Tokyo Institute of Technologies. And also today's presentation is based on the this journal articles entitled Decarbonizations of the Power Sector to Engender a Just Transitions in Japan. Okay. So today I will make a presentation following this agenda. Firstly, I will touch upon the background and importance of employment issues for the rural area in Japan. Then secondly, I will show the result of analysis for the employment impact of the renewable energies on the rural areas. Then I make a summary and way forward. Then let's move on to the first content. So this slide shows the background of research. So in October 2021, Japanese government has published 6 strategic energy plans. In this plan, renewable energy is defined as a major source on the top priorities. So compared with the previous strategic energy plan, the word on the top priorities newly added. So therefore, it seems that renewable energy market is promising, but there are several issues. The first, local resistance opposed to large-scale solar power plants and wind farms due to the nature conservations, disaster risk, landscapes. So this figure shows the number of regulations against large-scale solar power plant by municipalities. Obviously, this number has been increased. And second, so increased number of electric retailers. So since electricity market was liberalized in 2016, number of electric retail companies has been increased. So they need to have a kind of new value added rather than just to sell electricity from renewable energies. Otherwise, some company could not survive in this competition. So having these situations, it could be important to show a story where renewable energies have benefit for local areas, for both businesses and local communities. So among several kind of benefit, these studies focus on employment as a co-benefit of renewable energies. So then this slide shows Japanese population structures or age structures from 1960 to 2050s. So you can see that Japan's total number of population will be decreased until 2050s, and also share of elderly populations is increasing. So Japan goes to the rapid aging societies. This is the same for the structure of employees. This is a structure of employees by sectors: primary industries, secondary industry, and tertiary industries. In particular, is average age of primary industry, which includes agriculture and forestry, is aged 61.3 years old in average. Even for secondary industry and tertiary industries, average years old of working population is ages, which is around 45 years old. So in addition to this trend, so many people goes to South Kanto area, which includes Tokyo city, from the rural area. So this figure shows the population outflows by regions. So people from Tohoku area, Hokkaido areas going to South Kanto area. This trend is driven by basically wages. So many people to go city area to make to earn more money. So this is the status of current Japanese societies. So then what would be happened if the current social and economic structures continues there until 2045? So we have just calculated average age of working age populations based on the estimations by IPCC, which is an institution for populations and social securities. with the National Institute. So just we have simply calculated the working age populations. The result is here. In particular, so Tohoku regions, which has marked high score, highest age of average working age populations compared with national averages. Also, Hokkaido, Hokuriku, Shikoku region, those where location is a bit far from city areas such as Tokyo, Osaka, Fukuoka, as also aged. On the other hand, Kanto area is relatively better compared with other regions. So this means that uneven distributions of working age population would happen in Japan if current status is continued. So this is more a deep analysis in Tohoku area. So this is a comparison between 2015 status and 2045 status. As you can see that majority of working age population is between the range of 60 to 69 years old. So it's, on the other hand, the Kanto comparisons of Kanto regions, it's more or less flat. So there's a two peaks. There's not only 60s, but also 40s. There's a majority of working age populations. So which means that Tohoku region has less diversities of working age generations. So this leads some concerns about social issues. So we called shrinking spiral caused by super age societies. So outflow of young people, if outflow of young people continues, so obviously it leads to less intergenerational diversities, then more difficult to develop new ideas and business among those aged communities. Then more people would go out those local regions, then it would accelerate less intergenerational diversities. So this kind of negative spiral would happen. So we need to seriously take care of this phenomena. So then next question is how to attract young people. It's really hard, but there are some signals by the questionnaires from private companies. So this is a result of questionnaires for the questions about if you notice that the company works on SDGs, are you motivated to work for the companies? So then more than 90% of youngers or students responded as yes. Then this right-hand figure, this shows the reason for applying companies. So people or young persons apply companies with high social contributions and with long-term strategy to expand their businesses. So from those two facts, SDG and sustainable growth strategy of companies attract young people. So renewable energy could be one of the key resources for that directions. So then going back to the situation of Tohoku area, so Tohoku area has the second largest renewable energy potential in Japan, and also it is Tohoku area is close to the Tokyo, which is the largest electricity demand. And then between Tohoku and Tokyo area, there's a large capacities of transmission line. So renewable energies in Tokyo area can transmit electricity to this Tokyo area. So this is a kind of advantage of these regions. So having that background, so I'd like to move on to the part of analytical result of employment impacts. So this slide shows the research questions in this presentation, mainly two contents. So first one is how much renewable energies improve average age of working age populations in rural area. So second one is how much renewable energy improves uneven distribution of working age populations at a municipality level in a rural area. So I will show those results. So for this calculation, methodology is shown here. This is a kind of simple approach to quantify the impact of employment by renewable energies. Firstly, we calculate the reference scenarios of working age populations in the regions based on the national estimates of populations. Then identifying the scenarios of installation capacities of renewable energies under the decarbonized societies by region. So we reviewed several studies with which having decarbonized scenarios and increasing renewable energies. Then thirdly, calculate numbers of employees created by renewable energy using employment factors. So employment factor is taken from IO table, so which is already introduced by Robert in previous slide. Probably similar approaches. Then finally, we calculated average age of working age populations and also calculated Gini coefficient as an indicator of uneven distributions of working age population. So then this slide shows a result for the first questions, how much energy could improve average age of working age populations. So the answer is here, so just it improved only 0.1 point in two regions. So in left-hand side, it is a structure of working age populations in different scenario. So average age of secondary sector of industry is just 51.8 years old. On the other hand, average age of secondary sector of industries in highly renewable energy scenarios is 51.7 years old. So, and also, as you can see, those figures, structure looks not so big differences. So this is because that in terms of the number of employees, power sector has not so major sector. It has only 1% of employees in Japan. So even though it has a massive renewable energy implementations, so possible creations of number of jobs is not so big impact. On the other hand, when we focusing on the distributions of working age population, the story could be different. So this figure shows the result of Gini coefficient of working age populations in each region. So we calculated those numbers based on the job opportunities at municipality level. So Tohoku region locates here. In the different scenarios, the Gini coefficient, which is unequal distributions of working age populations status, which is a second worst in Japan in different scenario. But when we see the high renewable energy scenario or deep decarbonization scenarios, so the average scores of Gini coefficient is almost same as national average. So which it has significantly impact on the distributions of working age population. This is the one findings. So then this is the end of my presentation. So this study is focused on the employment impacts of renewable energies, which could be important factors in expanding renewable energies. Particularly in rural area, renewable energy could be a very important sources or basis of long-term strategies to attract young people because it has high potential to contribute social value added. And also it's important to avoid shrinking spiral and build a sustainable communities. Then our analytical result or quantitative result shows that renewable energies has the effect of improve uneven distributions of working age populations. But in terms of the number of average years of working age populations, the impact is limited. So therefore, for the future research, it's also important to analyze the impact for the whole economies, including industrial sectors or non-educated sectors, because those sectors has a more kind of potential to change the status of job opportunities. And also, it's also important to consider the issues in the local communities caused by aging societies. So it is also important to not only quantify the number of employees, but also it's important to analyze the effect on the affected communities by policies. So that's all from side. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Akihisa. I think it's really interesting to think about the impact on the age structure of the working population, probably an issue that hasn't had much attention to date. So now that we've heard from the two presenters, I'd like to invite the other panelists to join us. So if they are able to turn on their cameras so that we can see them. Great, everybody's appearing. That's wonderful. And I think before I go to the questions that are in the question and answer, I would just like to introduce the panelists and ask each of them perhaps just to speak for 1 or 2 minutes, either in reaction to what they've heard or if they've got some other points that they'd like to put into our discussion. So just by way of introduction, we've got Naoya Abe from the Tokyo Institute of Technology. We've got Richard Hanna from Imperial College and the UK Energy Research Centre. We've got Philippe Quirion from CIRAD, and we've got Jayashree Roy from AIT. So maybe I'll ask you to just provide some short thoughts in that order. So starting off with Naoya, would you like to share some thoughts with us?
Okay, thank you, Professor Taylor. And thank you for the presenters. It was quite interesting. And I'm actually the co-presenter of the second presentations. And I really feel encouraged that our interest is quite overlapped. And we are concerning not only about the quantity of the job, but also the quality of the job. And that would ultimately relate to the well-being of the workers and the citizens. And I would think that the challenge is how to actually quantify our discussion in a sense, because the statistics and the data is actually limited. Although the first presentations by the Professor Gross and the second presentation, we utilize the IO framework, but there will be other framework, hopefully, but maybe quite limited. So that's my very first impressions. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Now moving to Richard.
Yeah, so I worked with Robert Gross on the analysis for the Green Jobs Review. So I have some observations on that to add to what Rob said. The first is that the review was focusing on renewable and energy efficiency. So we didn't consider sort of wider definitions of green job creation. So it should be viewed in that context. And the next is, well, a point that is starting to recur in this session is about quantity of job creation and quality of job creation. And again, we found that there's very extensive evidence on quantity of job creation, although the metrics need much better standardization. But generally, the sort of evidence on quality of jobs in renewable energy efficiency or decent work is much poorer. And evidence on where jobs are created, where green jobs are created, seems particularly poor. I mean, we did extract some insights on that in relation to the life stage of technologies. So, you know, we identified that, say, solar PV and wind power may have higher job creation potential for, say, manufacturing, but the extent to which that's realised depends upon whether a country has an extensive manufacturing base, and even if it does, it may, you know, export significant amounts of those jobs effectively abroad. But construction, installation or operation maintenance jobs are much more likely to be created locally. So that was an interesting finding. And then my final point was, yeah, on sort of quality of jobs, we identified that particularly direct employment in renewable energy has been linked quite widely in the literature to more sort of temporary short-term work in, say, yeah, construction of renewables. But operation and maintenance of renewables tends to be sort of more permanent jobs over the life cycle of the technologies. So that's something
that needs to be borne in mind in terms of sequential planning required to say reduce or to coordinate local labour required for expanding renewables, and sort of reduce time gaps between projects and possibly need for workers to relocate if they're moving from, say, one short-term job to another. So that's all my thoughts. Thanks very much. And now move to Philippe.
Thanks a lot for the invitation and for the great presentations. I've worked on the topic on France, and hence I have a couple of remarks and questions for Rob first. Did you look at the consistency of the results between studies based on input-output tables and studies based on macroeconomic or CGE models? This is something that we have investigated in a theoretical model, an applied model with my colleague Quentin Perrier. And well, we found rather consistent, generally consistent results, but not always. It depends on the mechanisms involved. Another question that I have is, do you think there is a general reason for which there are in general more jobs sorry, in energy efficiency and renewables than on fossils? It's well, I see an obvious reason for a country which is not producing fossils, but and compared to nuclear, well, do you think there is a general reason, or rather it really depends on the activities involved? Also, you've mentioned induced jobs at the beginning of your presentation, but it seems to me that there are different definitions of this, what an induced job is. And so if you can specify this, I think we need in general better definition of this term in the literature. And I really like the focus on the qualitative dimension of jobs, which is not very widespread because it's more data demanding, but it's really useful. Concerning the presentation by Akihisa, I was really interested in the results that sustainable development goals are a way to attract young people. This is also something that we observe in France. So there's been a call by students actually for an ecological awakening. Is the name of this call, pour un réveil écologique in French. And this is really something that works, for, at least for qualified jobs, high-skilled jobs. And I met once the head of the French industrial umbrella organization, and he wasn't really not afraid of future regulations. It seemed to me that he knew he's got enough lobbying power to avoid them in the future, but he was really frightened of having too few highly qualified young people working in the industry, in polluting industries, for ecological reasons. This is really something new and really interesting for the future. And my question would be, did you see some differences across the mitigation option, climate change mitigation options that you have looked at, because there may be very different effects between, for instance, solar photovoltaics or biogas. Probably it's not the same jobs and possibly not the same age groups which are involved.
Thanks very much, Philip. Perhaps we can just hold those questions in our mind, because I'd like to bring in Jayashree, and then I'll come back to Rob and Naya to answer them. So Jayashree.
Hi, thank you very much for giving this opportunity. And I think this was a very good discussion. But what I felt is that both the discussions focused more on the renewable energy sector only, and this should not give an impression that the climate neutral, sustainable society is only going to be renewable energy sector led, right? So it's going to be much, much wider. So we were doing some studies to look into the macro perspective, as you all have done. So to see that what it really means if the different sectors really change in terms of, so the new economic sectors are going to emerge, right? Say climate smart agriculture. Then if we think in terms of the transport sector, for all the sectors, if we see, so there is, so basically there is going to be an environmental resource-based economic growth. And if we think of it, then what Jim started with initially about moving away from the GDP-based accounting system, which would mean if we take the well-being as a goal, which will include GDP as one, but then many other indicators also, then I think the climate neutral society will actually have many more expansion of the now the core economy. So given that framework, I feel that, not only feel, we did a study and we saw that basically there will be more new economic activities which are going to emerge. And I'm talking from a developing country perspective, so that because there is growing population and new economic activities are going to emerge, so it will be very important to look into, as it has been said by Robert, that we need to see where the jobs are going to go up and where the jobs are going to go down, and then to see what will be the net impact. So I think that is an analysis which is very important, just not look into only one single sector, but then look into the other sectors also to come up with a kind of conclusion that what will be the impact on job. But I feel that there is, so if we think in terms of quantity of job, then of course I can see that we can actually establish that there is going to be more jobs created. So from that point of view, that is one conclusion I think we need to see, and that we need to see from different country perspective. And secondly, if we look into that, how the, so we looked into in the presentations about the renewable energy, but we did not talk about the clean energy, and clean energy will be going beyond the renewable energy also. So what would it mean? Say, I'm giving an example. We were working in Bangladesh and we're trying to see that the whole economy is gas dependent, and they have a whole infrastructure and human power, skilled manpower to run the gas industry. So what will be a better transition? And in that transition, how the reskilling of people can be the least costly, and because they do not have enough land to go for more solar. So what will be the transition? So maybe geothermal, maybe hydrogen, but this discourse is not happening in these developing countries at all. So I think from the developing country perspective, there are many, many questions which needs to be addressed and which are very different than what it is for countries like UK or Japan. So that is going to be very different. Just to give an example, in Vietnam, I can see that the young people who are getting trained in energy sector are rushing to their economy because the renewable sector is employing them. So this is something very different than what we see in Japan. So, I mean, developing country perspective is really different, and I think we really need to look into that. So what we need is that, so I think three things came up really, which is good. One is, if we look at job as a variable of economic growth, then, or outcome variable, then whether it is going to rise or fall, and what will be the net impact. And then we are looking into the job market structure, so where the jobs will be shifting. And if that happens, then what it means for the human resource planning from a country's perspective. I think for developed and developing countries, these are going to be very different, and structurally, structural changes, what will happen will also determine what will be the impact. So if you have other country experiences also, we would like to hear from you, and I'll stop here now. We can come back later.
Thank you very much. So I'll first of all turn to Rob, perhaps just to respond to some of those comments from Philippe and from Jayashri and anybody else.
Thanks, Peter. I will bring Richard in order to provide any more points of detail or correct me if I'm wrong. I think in response to the I think there was a question as to why there appear to be more jobs created in renewable energy than in conventional energy. I think that there's a number of reasons for that, and one of the things that I stressed was the use of the metric. So if you're looking at sort of per unit of installed capacity, so it might simply be a product of load factor. You know, renewables technologies tend to operate at a lower load factor than traditional fossil fuel technologies, and so therefore you would expect, and historically this is less true than it was, but the data that we've been looking at goes back over sort of 7 or 8 years. Historically they were also more expensive to install, so you would expect to see a higher kind of, you know, job per pound or yen spent. But you do still see it in the per unit of energy delivered, which suggests that these are inherently more labour intensive kinds of activity. We don't really speculate about the reasons for that in the report, but obviously what you're looking at is something that's more geographically dispersed. So you're therefore, you know, you're looking at something that's more capital intensive. If you think about the way in which you get energy from a traditional fossil fuel power station, and if you think about even a metric such as the levelized cost of energy delivered, for a gas-fired power station, about half of that is the cost of the gas that you're continuously burning. So when you move to renewables, you're moving to something that's more capital intensive with no fuel. And that, I think, is also reflected in the kind of requirements for the labour inputs as well as the material inputs. But I mean, seems to me a sensible thing. But we weren't actually going after that in our evidence review. Just to pick up a couple of other points, and then I'll hand over to Richard. The reason we looked at energy efficiency and renewable energy is because in many countries they have had a long tradition of quite strong policy support, either through regulation or through subsidy. In the previous section, Jim Watson mentioned that we haven't yet had very much success with carbon capture and storage internationally by comparison to renewables. But I would extend, you know, we're not saying that the only green technologies are energy efficiency and renewables by any means. Just in regards to gas, yeah, I mean, obviously the biggest single source of CO2 emissions globally is coal combustion. If we move from coal combustion to gas combustion, we will, you know, like for like, roughly half the amount of CO2 emissions. But gas isn't a zero carbon fuel. That, you know, gas is not the answer in a kind of, you know, net zero context. And, you know, in a kind of European and American context, you know, we've already had a lot of fuel switching towards gas, and we're looking to step beyond that. But I do understand all of the points, and I agree with you entirely about thinking about what's different in a different type of economy. It's not just, I think, developing countries versus rich countries. I mean, the structure of Japan's economy is different from the structure of the UK's economy. The structure of the UK's economy is different from the structure of Germany's economy. And so we need to understand these local specificities. Thanks.
Richard, did you want to add anything just briefly?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on Philippe also made a point about sort of did we consider CGE models or input-output models? And just to say that, yeah, I mean, our review did pick up a range of studies that included ones which used input-output tables, CGE models, and also just sort of empirical employment surveys as well. But just an observation on input-output tables, this is a commonly used method for generating data on quantity of job creation. But the problem with it is that national input-output tables tend to be quite outdated, so 5 to 10 years out of date, which is a bit of a problem with them. But on the other hand, you do get quite a high granularity of data. So some studies have started to look at this sort of occupational breakdown using those tables to get an idea of sort of some of the quality of job creation in renewables, for example. And the other quick point was, yeah, you mentioned, you know, defining what a job is. I mean, I think we found this is a key difficulty. Obviously, you've got kind of the full-time equivalent metric, but then some studies just quantified jobs, other studies quantified job years, you know, job created for 1 year. Some studies looked over the lifetime of technologies. I could go on. It's very confusing and difficult to compare some of these studies.
Thanks, Richard. Now I'd like to come to Akihisa, just in case you've got any response to what we've been talking about.
Okay, firstly, I'd like to respond to questions by Phillips. In terms of the options of technologies, renewable technologies. So in the original article, we have differentiated several types of renewable energies. So we have differentiated mix of those technologies reviewing by several scenarios. So the options include solars, wind, offshore wind, and onshore wind, and also biomass power generations and geothermals, and also small part of tidal waves. Then in terms of employment factor, also we identified each of employment factors for each power generation types. So then we calculated impact on number of employees increase depending on the scenarios, and also we show the range of those changes of employees in each sectors. So those kind of sensitivity analysis is already conducted in the original papers. So then regarding to the Josh's questions, yeah, as I talked about in the end of the presentation, so it's also important to make analysis on 4 sectors, not only power sector, but also other sectors, including industries. So in terms of the number of employees, so those particularly industrial sectors and service sectors has a major share of employees. So definitely Japan's future employment is depending on the status of those sectors. So on the other hand, to quantify the employment impact of those scenarios, firstly, it's really hard to make scenarios of 2050 net zero status. So there could be really diverse kind of pathways or like scenario or status of for economies when net zero is achieved, even in Japan. So probably this is kind of out of scope of academic exercise, but it's more kind of consultations exercise with relevant stakeholders. So through that kind of consultations, we need to kind of make some ideas how community would be affected by those net zero status. So this is what we are seeing as challenges. And regarding to AGM issues, also, it's different. So actually, I just have like a rough surveys on net zero status, in particular potential of renewable energy. So large difference between Japan and Asian country is potential of solar. Solar power is much potential than Japan's, and also probably a profile of energy demand is also different. So in Japan, we have winter seasons, and during winter seasons, share of renewable energy is much difficult. Increasing share of renewable energy is hard. On the other hand, country has a different climate conditions. So probably status of using technologies is also different by regions, seeing the potentials of new energies and also people's lifestyles. So yeah, we have to be respect to that different circumstance into this kind of analysis. So thank you.
Thank you. Now we've only got about 4 minutes left, but I am keen that I pose some of the questions from the audience. So Rob, there was a couple for you that maybe you could just answer very briefly on. One was around the status and payment differences between green jobs and fossil jobs. I think you covered that, but perhaps you'd just like to elaborate a little bit. Another interesting question, I think, is around the role of digitalization on the nature of jobs. I don't know whether you have seen anything about that or would like to make a comment, but perhaps we'll take those two for now.
I think, yeah, very briefly, I think we did provide some evidence that suggests that there's quite a high predominance of reasonably sort of more senior roles in wind generation in the UK instance. But then I also showed the slide that showed how wide-ranging the kind of distribution of different roles is across different sectors. So I'm not sure that we can say for sure that renewables or energy efficiency, create a particular quality of job or create decent jobs. I think, one of the things, the way I'd frame this is something that we want to do anyway. And so therefore we should be looking to maximize the opportunities that come with it. It's not something that we're doing as a job creation scheme, because that would be kind of crazy. We could think of other things to do. But given the fact that we want to do decarbonisation, let's make sure that we provide, opportunities for citizens, and it will provide lots of opportunities. There is no question about that. It's a major endeavour, and it will bring lots and lots of jobs and opportunities for well-paid, decent work with it. Sorry, Peter, I've forgotten the second one.
Digitalisation, the impact thereof.
I mean, Richard, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we looked at that specifically. And I would say that goes very wide-ranging impacts across the whole economy, including the energy sector, including low carbon energy, but not exclusive to it.
Okay, thank you. Navaki, so there's a question about how is immigration considered in the estimates? Perhaps you'd like to.
Yeah, that is also good question. So this is a kind of our analysis just seeing part of job market. So we haven't differentiated Japanese persons or immigrated persons. So this could be also need to be addressed in future. So far we didn't differentiate immigrant peoples.
Okay, well, sadly, we are out of time. There are still a number of questions in the question and answer. So if any of the panelists or speakers want to have a look at that, there is, I think, the opportunity for you to actually type an answer. So I'd encourage you to do that if you see one that you think you can answer. But otherwise, I would like to thank both the speakers and the panelists very much for, I think, a very interesting and stimulating discussion. And with that, I think I will hand back to the organisers. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your participation. We could have a very fruitful and useful discussions. Tomorrow we will have another session, starting the opening presentation by Professor Derk Loorbach, and followed by the session 3 on international collaboration and session 4 on finance. Looking forward for your participation tomorrow. Thank you again.